The next thing I want to work on is building a responsive Navbar with Tailwind. So since Tailwind as a framework encourages a mobile-first workflow, we're going to start with the mobile layout. Now the workflow that I find the easiest with Tailwind is to start by just putting all of the HTML structure in place and then adding the styling after the fact. So why don't we start by creating a header element here. And now in most of these Navbars, they're usually broken up into like maybe 2 or more pieces. You can think there's usually like the logo and stuff on the left, and then on the right is where you'd have all of the links, or on mobile, it's where you maybe have like a hamburger menu icon. So why don't we create 2 divs for each chunk? So we'll have a div for sort of the stuff that goes on the left, and then we'll have a div for the stuff that goes on the right. I think it would be cool to use like a dark background for this header, so I've gone ahead and created an inverted version of our logo that will work on a dark background, and I've added that to the public directory, so we can just grab that at image / logo inverted .svg. We can add some alt text here, so we can just say workation. And since we're starting with the mobile layout, why don't we go ahead and just add a button with a hamburger icon in it on the right hand side. So I'll create a button element here. We'll give it a type of button, and then inside of it, I'm just going to paste this SVG that I have in my clipboard for a hamburger menu icon. Now this, of course, looks nothing like how we want it to look, so let's start by adding some basic styles. First, let's go ahead and add a background color. So why don't we try something like maybe BG Gray 800, see how that looks? Let's go a little bit darker, BG Gray 900. And we can't actually see this icon, the hamburger menu icon, so let's go ahead and add some classes to the SVG so that shows up. Why don't we try like H4W4, and you can see it there, it's black, so it's kind of hard to see, so let's give it a color so it actually stands out. Why don't we do something like fill current so that we can use the text color utilities to style it. And let's go ahead and add a text color to the button itself so that we can change it on focus and stuff if we want to kind of add some different styles. So if we just start with like text white, that should show up. And I think this actually looks a little bit small, so why don't we bump this up to maybe H6W6, see how that looks. Yeah, I think that's going to be a little bit closer. I think the white is probably a little too high contrast, so why don't we tone that down? Maybe we'll do like maybe like gray 300, see what that looks like. Maybe even a little bit darker. What about like gray 500? Yeah, I think that'll look pretty good. So then maybe on focus, we could do something like text white. So that way, when you tab to it, it gets lighter. Let's also get rid of that focus ring. Since we are adding our own focus styles, we don't really need to have that separate glow. I think we could probably also make it go white on hover, so you can actually kind of see that you're hovering over it. So why don't we do the same thing there? So we'll go hover, text white, and focus text white. And now, yeah, when you hover over it, it changes color. Next, this logo is obviously way too big if we just want it to be over on the left. So the way that I'm going to style this is by just adding a height and leaving the width set to auto. So we're going to add a class here, and why don't we do something like H6 and see what happens there. I think that's probably a little bit too small, maybe like H8. And width is going to be auto by default. So this way the image is just going to take up whatever space it needs to width-wise based on the height in order to preserve sort of the intrinsic aspect ratio of the image. Okay, now we have to get this button over to the right-hand side of this menu somehow. So how are we going to do that? Well, in the past, you might have done something like float right when you needed to do this sort of thing, right? So this kind of sort of works. You can see it moves it over to the right, but things are kind of screwed up still. And this ends up being a real pain to get right and to do it in any sort of like clean and maintainable way. These days, it's much easier to build this sort of layout using Flexbox. So let's delete this class, and I'll teach you a little bit about how Flexbox works. So the first thing we need to do is add the flex class to the parent element that holds sort of the left side and the right side. And this will turn it into a flex container. Now, what happens when you make something a flex container is that the children, by default, get laid out left to right with no space in between them, which is really convenient if you've ever dealt with that problem where you're trying to build columns or something and just having like white space in the editor creates like a tiny bit of a gap between things. With Flexbox, there is no gap, which is really nice. Now, to control where each piece sort of ends up, we can use the align items property and the justify content property. To make this a little bit easier to teach, I'm going to add another element here that we're not actually going to keep, just so you can understand sort of how this works better. So why don't we add like this login text, and we'll go ahead and make it white so you can actually see it. Okay, so now we have three pieces. We have the logo, we've got the login text, and we've got the button. So you can arrange these things in sort of two dimensions. Align items controls where these elements are positioned vertically, and justify content positions how they're arranged horizontally. So let's focus on align items first. So by default, align items is set to stretch, which means that both of these divs are filling the full height of the parent container. The easiest way to see that is to add like a background color here. So say we were to add like BG gray 700, you can see, yeah, this block that contains the word login is full height. And the same thing is true of the div that holds the button. Now, if we wanted to align these items to the top instead of stretching them, all we have to do is set align items to flex start, which we can do in Tailwind using the items start class. So now you can see this item isn't full height. You can see the background sort of shrunk because these elements are now positioned right at the top. If we wanted to align them along the bottom, we could use items end. Now, the reason that the button didn't move in this case is because button elements are inline block by default, which means they're affected by line height. So this element is actually a little bit taller than it looks. If we set this to be a block level button, you'll see that the button does jump down to the bottom. So here's another option that you'll probably be really excited about. Say we wanted to center these items. Well, unlike back in the old days where doing this was a total nightmare and you had to do weird things with line height or tables and all sorts of crazy crap, these days you can just do items center. Now all these items will be perfectly center aligned. Isn't that beautiful? Okay, so for this navbar, we probably do want to use item center. Like I think it makes sense for this button to be centered with this logo. So let's stick with item center and start talking about how justify content works, which is what we use to lay elements out horizontally. So by default, justify content is set to flex start, which means all of the elements are kind of butted up together on the left side. If we wanted to put things on the right side, we could use the justify end class, and now you can see, yeah, everything jumps to the end. We can also use justify between, which will put an equal amount of space between every item, which is really nice. And we can also use justify around, which will put an equal amount of space around every item. So you can imagine that like this element here is like this wide, this one here is this wide, and this one here is this wide. So a couple really cool, interesting options. Now for our use case, we want the logo to be all the way on the left and the button to be all the way on the right. So I think justify between is the one that we're going to want to stick with. Now we don't actually need this login text here. We just had that there for sort of demonstrative purposes. So let's get rid of that and then spend a couple seconds here just sort of cleaning up these styles. I don't think we want everything to be sort of full width here. We probably want a little bit of horizontal padding. So I'm going to head up to this element here, and why don't we try something like maybe PX4 to add some left and right padding, and then maybe something like a PY2 for some vertical padding, maybe even PY3. And yeah, I think that looks pretty good. So that's a quick sort of overview of how you can sort of build these really common layouts using Flexbox instead of a bunch of hacky floats and stuff like that. And in the next lesson, we're going to talk about making this button actually work to pop open sort of a section where we can add these links on mobile.